As a biographer, I am concerned with what Nixon said and did, planned and hoped, attempted and achieved, Stephen Ambrose writes in the second volume of his biography of the 37th President of the United States. As to question of motive, of why he did what he did, I confess that I do not understand this complex man. It is not news that he was devious, manipulative, driven by unseen and unknowable forces, quick as a summer storm to blame and slow as a glacier melt to forgive, passionate in his hatred, self-centered, untruthful, untrusting, and at times so despicable that one wants to avert one's eyes in shame and embarrassment. Nor is it news that this same man could be considerate, straightforward, sympathetic, and helpful, or that he was blessed with a great talent, a superb intellect, an awesome memory, and a remarkable ability to see things whole, especially on a global scale, and with regard to the world balance of power. If he was the ultimate cynic, a president without principle in domestic politics, he was also the ultimate realist, a president without peer in foreign affairs. Why these contradictions? I don't know. I only know they were there. I see my job as one of pointing them out within the context of explaining what Nixon was doing with what results. In 1879, Franklin Milhouse married Almra Berg, the two raising 9 children, which included a girl named Hannah, born in 1885. In 1873, Samuel Brady Nixon, son of Union Army officer George Nixon III, married Sarah Ann Wadsworth, the couple having 5 children. Their second was Francis Anthony Nixon, nicknamed Frank, and born on December 3rd, 1878, in Benton County, Ohio. Hannah entered Whittier College, attending for 2 years before dropping out and meeting Frank Nixon at a social gathering at the Friends Church in East Whittier. Frank would later testify that after walking Hannah home that night, I immediately stopped going with the 5 other girls I was dating, and I saw Hannah every night. Frank worked at the Citrus Ranch until Hannah became pregnant, and her father both invited the pair to live in his home and also give him a job as a ranch foreman. The couple's first child, Harold, was born in 1909, and the Nixons moved to Lindsay to work on another ranch. By 1912, they returned to Southern California and bought a small lemon ranch in Yorba Linda. The land had a clay subsoil and lacked good draining or producing good lemons. Ambrose describes Yorba Linda as a town with a good climate and soil with land that grew marvelous citrus crops. The people coming into Yorba Linda, mostly young couples and almost all Quakers, imposed a Puritan streak on the town that saw no liquor stores, bars, dance halls, or theaters. Frank refused to go into debt even if it meant improving his land. This led to the family living on the edge of poverty, with Hannah having nothing to serve but cornmeal, and Frank only owning 1 shirt and a pair of pants along with a suit for work. On January 9th, 1913, Hannah was ready to deliver her second child. Fearing the doctors would not arrive in time and going to the young widow Ella Furness for help with the birth before the doctor and nurse Henrietta Shockney arrived. Hannah named the 11-pound, dark-haired, and brown-eyed baby Richard after Rich and the Lionhearted, and gave him the middle name Milhouse. The pregnancy had taken its toll on Hannah, who went to the hospital for a mastoid operation when Richard was 9 months old, and went to Whittier to live with her parents during her recovery. This period saw Richard become his grandmother Almira's favorite, the latter walking, cuddling, and burping him. In 1918, Hannah was pregnant again, and Richard, then 5 years old, would later write, "Mother was always on a visit. Father came over to where we boys were quarreling over some toys and told us that there was a little doll over at the hospital for us, a real live doll. Naturally, we then began to quarrel over whose doll it would be, although each of us wished to have it merely to keep one of the others from getting it. Frank assured the boys they would all have equal access to the doll, and the boys found out the doll was a baby. The child was Arthur, and Richard paid little attention to him. Remembering their preference for punishment from their father over their mother, Richard remarked, 'In our family, we would always prefer spanking.'" Nixon remembered of his parents. "There was a drive to succeed. My mother and father instilled in us the desire to get going, to be good, not just that one single thing, but at everything. Frank argued constantly, and his wife maneuvered around it by keeping quiet and never crossing him when he was upset. When Richard began grade school in 1918, he was active in baseball and football games, his mother remembering that he could play the piano without discord by the time he was 7 years old. And it was at that age that he began taking violin lessons with her brother Griffith. Ambrose calls Frank the most influential teacher in his son's life, the elder Nixon teaching Sunday school, and his son attending regularly starting at age 5. After the Teapot Dome scandal broke in 1924, Frank denounced corrupt politicians and the lawyers who defended them, Richard telling his mother, "When I get big, I'll be a lawyer they can't bribe." Ambrose observes young Richard as a boy who attacked with words, and although he could never defeat almost anyone in sports competition, he beat them all as a speaker and as a student. Many of Richard's attitudes originated from his father, citing Frank as preaching a simple doctrine that in America, with hard work and determination, a man can achieve anything. Ambrose writes, "The inability to trust anyone is one of the principal personality traits of Nixon as an adult, a theme he returned to again and again in interviews, private conversations, and his writings about himself. He insists that in my job, he was then vice president, you can't enjoy the luxury of intimate personal friendships. You can't confide absolutely in anyone." What was the source of this trait? Nixon claimed that it went with the territory, that all professional politicians felt as he did, but that simply was not true. But then there is nothing in his inheritance or in his environment to explain his inability to trust. As a youth, he was surrounded by trusting people whom he had every reason to trust completely. In this regard, his childhood was so normal as to be dull. No one abused him, there were no traumas, no betrayals, only love and trust. Ambrose observes Whittier as an integral part of the Southern California boom, almost doubling in population during those boom years, and calling it little more than a large version of Yorba Linda when it came to purposes of social life or entertainment. Nixon lived here from ages 9 to 21, and the atmosphere of Whittier would become a part of him as influential as his education, religion, and physical growth. Following 2 years of working in the oil fields, Frank went to own his own businesses and bought a place in East Whittier and opened a gas station around Alhambra in Whittier. After the Friends made a new church, Frank bought the previous one and moved it to his lot and opened a general store, leasing the gas station to a neighbor before concentrating on the store. The Nixon parents spent all their working hours in the store except on Sundays, where Frank would both keep it open and attend church. Frank was remembered by a niece for having a nasty loud way and bellowing clear uptown when something went wrong. Among Richard's favorite books was Tom Sawyer, especially enjoying the episode where Tom tricked Ben Rogers into whitewashing his fence. Richard enjoyed it so much that he memorized it by heart. Richard was known for being conscientious about his schoolwork and arguing for the sake of arguing like his father. A classmate said he liked to argue about anything. No matter what was discussed, he would take the opposite side just for the sake of argument. Nixon's first debate concerned if it was more economical to rent a house instead of owning one, and was drilled by his father about the arguments, Richard later winning the debate. The boy enjoyed piano, living with his aunt, Jane Milhouse Beeson, for half a year when he was 12 so he could study piano and take lessons. Nixon's semester of school that year saw him take his first course in American history, Jane remembering that he became inspired and fascinated with the Constitution, as well as those who helped create it. Richard read biographies of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, as well as avidly reading the newspaper. In June 1925, Richard returned to Whittier, being greeted with a kiss by his brother Arthur. As Richard would remember, the summer saw Arthur become slightly ill with a condition that worsened to the point of doctors being summoned to the house, as the child only wanted to rest and sleep. After the other boys were sent to live with an aunt, they were awakened at midnight and driven home, where they discovered Arthur had died from encephalitis or tubercular meningitis. As Richard would later write, "For weeks after Arthur's funeral, there was not a day that I did not think about him and cry." Ambrose observes that Richard's reaction to Arthur's passing was to do even better and make up for the loss to his parents. The author notes that psychobiographers of Nixon have tried to spectate on the effect Arthur's passing had on him and concludes, "There is no evidence whatsoever that Nixon's reaction to his brother's death was in any way pathological." The Nixon family store continued to be run, Richard being put in charge of the vegetable counter when he became old enough to drive. Richard entered high school in fall 1926, living halfway between Whittier High and Fullerton High, going to the latter school because the bus service did not go to Whittier High. He was known for engaging in verbal fights rather than physical ones and for being honorable as a football player. Richard transferred to Whittier High in fall 1928 when regular school bus service began and was known by a number of students before the transfer. Richard was concerned with his physical appearance, insisting on wearing a tie and having a clean, starched shirt each morning. A girl working with his mother declaring, "Give me anything to iron but Richard's shirts. He's too fussy." Richard entered the oratorical contest sponsored by the Kiwanis Club, the subject being the Constitution, and Nixon delivering a speech entitled Our Privileges Under the Constitution, in which he asserted, "The chief desire of a man is that his life and personal liberty may be well protected." Nixon furthered that the sovereignty of the people was the greatest of the constitutional privileges, and that it was expressed in both the right to vote and the right to hold office. Nixon won the contest and participated the following year. This speech, entitled America's Progress, Its Dependence Upon the Constitution, began with a recounting of the growth of America since 1776 and offered three theories on explaining America's progress: race, luck, and political acumen. Nixon won again, though lost the competition at Monrovia High School by coming in second place. Harold contracted tuberculosis, a disease that ran in both the Nixon and Milhouse families. Frank refused to let his son go to a county tuberculosis hospital as to not be taking charity, and instead arranged for Harold to go to a private sanatorium. Although Harold at first appeared to be improving, his condition worsened, and Hannah insisted on taking the boy to the high, dry Arizona mountains, a source believed to be the proper climate for TB cases, and staying with him. Hannah rented the cabin at $25 per month and took in three other tubercular patients to help cover the cost. Frank ran the store alone during the day and sometimes drove 800 miles to Prescott for the weekends. Richard reflected that the separation made the boy share in adversity and grow strong, though he would admit that it was a disaster from a financial standpoint, with his mother never buying a new dress during the 5 years of Harold's illness. Nixon spent the summer of 1928 and 1929 with his mother and four TB patients. In 1930, 45-year-old Hannah discovered she was pregnant and the baby, a boy named Edward, was born in the Whittier Hospital. Hannah came home with the baby, and a month after the child's birth, Richard graduated from high school. Ambrose writes, his ability to deny what others regard as obvious became his way of dealing with things beyond his control. He denied at 17 and later in his life as well that having to go to Whittier rather than Harvard disappointed him. He insisted that Whittier was plenty good enough. But could it possibly have been true? Could a young man as bright as he was and as ambitious really not care whether he went to Harvard or Whittier? Still, denial that it hurt was much the most effective way to deal with the hurt. It could not be helped. The reality was that he could not go to Harvard. So it was realistic on Nixon's part to deny that he felt discriminated against or disappointed. Once again, he turned a negative into a positive. Nixon entered college in September 1930, usually studying until past midnight. Whittier College had around 400 students, having begun in 1887 as Quaker Academy. At the time of Nixon entering Whittier College, President Herbert Hoover, married to alumni Lou Henry, would send the library vast amounts of books. The school depended on free books as it was constantly on the brink of bankruptcy like so many other small liberal arts schools. In his senior year, Nixon wrote an essay on his personal religious beliefs, sketching out his opinions on the Bible and modern science. Within a month of school starting, Nixon was elected president of the class and organized the creation of a new men's society on the campus. The idea originated from Dean Triggs, who noted that the only men's society on campus was the Franklins and believed there needed to be competition. Nixon came up with the name Orthogonians and used the shape of a square as their symbol. Nixon became the first president, and although the chapter presented itself as seeking to boost campus spirit, it really served as a social club. The Orthogonians went out of their way to be as different from the Franklins as possible, and the Franklins called the Orthogonians the Big Pigs. Nixon was elected to the Honorary Society of Knights during his sophomore year and ran for vice president of the student government. He came in first during the primary and won the final election, a classmate remembering. He wanted to win all the time. No matter what he was doing, he wanted to be a winner. In May 1933, Nixon announced he would be a candidate for student body president, running against Thompson and concentrating on the issue of dancing on campus. Nixon won the election, Thompson later analyzing that the former's issue had student appeal and that his own was a little too practical. The president of the senior class delivered on each of his campaign pledges, organizing a reception for the entering freshmen. Nixon spoke to various clubs and civic groups, as well as high school classes, on the goods of playing football at Whittier. Through his high visibility, Nixon aroused resentment. A co-ed noted that the class president was not generally liked by the girls whom I knew best. Classmate Helen S. Larson remembered he had an almost ruthless cocksureness, which perhaps was the reason some students disliked him. The 1934 Acropolis featured Nixon in the front of the yearbook, the story concluding, "After one of the most successful years the college has ever witnessed, we stopped to reminisce and come to the realization that much of the success was due to the efforts of this very gentleman. Always progressive and with a liberal attitude, he has led us through the year with flying colors." Though Nixon never intended to play college football, only 11 men went out for the freshman team. So the coach came to Nixon and asked if he could substitute. Nixon complied and got to play in every game. Gail Jobe remembered that he and Nixon were cannon fodder and complimented Nixon as having guts for getting back up when they were knocked down. Charles Kendall recalled that Nixon was the first guy that would talk to a player when he was hurt and give him a pep talk. Nixon idealized Coach Newman, declaring that he admired him more than any man he had ever known apart from his father. Nixon had a romance with Ola Florence Welch, described by Ambrose as the most popular girl on campus, and a romance that continued through the full 4 college years. When Ola was asked by a friend why she wanted to go out with Richard, she declared, "I just thought he was the smartest man that ever was. We'd have marvelous arguments and talks. We used to argue politics constantly. He was a Republican. I thought Roosevelt was wonderful, and he detested him." The relationship became strained as time went on, Ola remembering that he'd be harsh and I'd cry before they made up. Nixon was on the 4-man debate team through all 4 years. The team manager, Ken Ball, recalling that Nixon was a successful debater due to his never being afraid of a challenge. Nixon was also a participant in each student play conducted during his college years. Professor Upton, who served as drama coach, praised Nixon as one of our first successful actors. "I wouldn't have been surprised if after college he had gone on to New York or Hollywood looking for a job as an actor." Nixon graduated from Whittier College in June 1934, having been in the Honor Society for the 4th year in a row and as the second in his class. A Nixon classmate remembered him always having to be the leader whenever he was involved in something, and that he tried to get everybody else involved in helping to do this and getting it going the way he thinks it should go. Nixon's triumphs at Whittier College demanded prophecy, with Ola Florence predicting he would go on to the Supreme Court, and the Orthogonians saying to each other of Nixon, "If this fellow keeps it up the way he is going, someday he will be president." Ambrose notes that Nixon had no real friends, with his campaign manager Bill Hornaday viewing him as having a barrier around him. The Duke Law School was new in 1934, though it had almost unlimited financial resources on the part of James Buchanan Duke, who left an endowment to Trinity College. Nixon was informed that while he had won a scholarship, he would need to keep a B average or better through his second and third year to retain the scholarship. Nixon arrived in Durham that September, finding the work more intense than it had been in Whittier. Nixon's concerns that he would not measure up to his classmates were discovered by upperclassman William Adelson, who told him, "Listen, Nixon, you needn't worry. The fact that you are studying so late yourself shows you don't mind hard work. You've got an iron butt, and that's the secret of becoming a lawyer." The law student's chief characteristic was his willingness to work, with the classmate remembering that Nixon differed from others in being a copybook kind of guy without being obnoxious about it. Professor Lou Fuller saw Nixon as having the suggestion of an intellectual inferiority complex. Another classmate called Nixon the hardest working man I ever met. Nixon would complain that he would never learn the law, leading classmates to dub him Gloomy Gus. He persisted, and by Christmas 1934, Nixon was averaging A's and near the top of his class. Nixon joined his brother Don in driving to New York City. The pair bought their mother a fur piece. Ambrose notes that Nixon had not only saved, but sacrificed for that gift, moving into a tool shed in the woods near campus that had a bed but lacked a stove. Nixon took a room at $5 a month after the Christmas vacation and shared a room with Bill Perdue, working afternoons in the library and studying in both the mornings and evenings. Nixon also had a romance with Ola that ended around this time, the relationship serving as the only contact he had with women during his law school years. In spring 1936, Nixon ran for president of the Duke Student Bar Association against Hale McCone, a campus figure who would later become a member of the Nebraska Supreme Court. Nixon easily prevailed. Late in the spring, Nixon, Perdue, and Frederick Albrink infiltrated the dean's office and learned that Nixon had fallen below third place with the three replacing everything and leaving. Ambrose writes that Nixon had Southern roommates that shared the prejudices and outlook of their region. Nixon was responsible for bringing William Brooke, the only black on campus, into the Orthogonians. A classmate remembered Nixon as being shocked and disturbed at the prevalent North Carolina treatment of the Negro population as an inferior group. During the Christmas vacation, Nixon used his savings to travel to New York City with Harlan Leathers for a session of job hunting and went to all the top firms in the city, which included Bill Donovan as a leader, Herbert Brownell Jr., later President Eisenhower's Attorney General, as a member, and Thomas Dewey as an associate. About a month after the trip, Nixon received a letter from Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Lombard requesting he return to New York for another interview, and Nixon went to his professor Lou Fuller for advice. The FBI was recruiting at Duke, and Nixon submitted an application. Dean Horrick, at Nixon's request, wrote a letter to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover praising Nixon as one of the finest young men, both in character and ability, that I had ever had the opportunity of having in my classes. When the FBI did not extend a job offer to Nixon, Horrick called Nixon to his office and advised him that he should go back to his hometown and establish himself in a law firm if he wanted to go into politics. Nixon graduated third in his class and was a member of the Honorary Society, the Order of the Coif. After Nixon drove back to Whittier, he learned that USC was giving a special prep course for law graduates who would take the California bar examination. Nixon passed easily and was sworn in as a practicing attorney before the California Supreme Court on November 9, 1937. Ambrose writes of Nixon at the time, "There were large vacuums in his life. He could memorize and summarize with the best anywhere, but there was little originality of thought. He was almost 25 years old, but he had no women friends, much less the love of a woman he loved. In fact, he had no close friends at all, not even Perdue, with whom he shared a bed for a year and a room for 1.5 years. They hardly saw each other after graduation day and barely corresponded." Ambrose continues, "He was a man most comfortable before an audience, most uncomfortable with individuals or a small group. He was a man of obvious leadership ability despite his lack of easy warmth and his loneliness of spirit. He was a man with first-rate mental equipment. Most of all, he was a man with a fierce drive, an eagerness to win, an insatiable hunger for success. He had learned all he could at Whittier and Duke. He was ready to launch his career and realize his ambitions, on which he placed no limits whatsoever." Nixon's return to Whittier was at a time when the town's population had increased to 25,000 and was becoming a suburb of Los Angeles, though Ambrose notes it was still small enough for family connections to matter, and Nixon used his to get his first job. Franklin Milhouse, Nixon's grandfather, had been partners with the grandfather of Thomas Bewley. Bewley was a partner with the Wingert and Bewley firm. After recommendations from Hannah and Professor Smith, Bewley interviewed Nixon and was impressed with his mature looks, actions, and thinking. He was decisive. He knew what he wanted. He was direct and to the point. It took us no more than 15 or 20 minutes to discuss our partnership. After a week, Nixon got his first case. Mary Shee was suing her uncle to pay back a $2,000 loan. When Nixon met with the opposition lawyer, David Schwartz, he asked if he could be of assistance to him when the home came up for sale. Schwartz advised him to bid the entire sum, and after Nixon did this, it was discovered there were 2 liens on the house. Countersuits were filed, and the end result was Mary Shee losing everything. Nixon then opened a law office in La Alhambra at a time when the town was growing and only had 2 lawyers. Bewley remembered Nixon handling cases pertaining to drunks, parking problems, and traffic, and that the young lawyer always seemed to be way ahead of the witnesses and could anticipate what answers the witnesses would make. 1939 saw Jeff Wingert and Bewley take Nixon as a partner, the latter remembering in his memoirs, "Now for the first time, I was no longer Frank and Hannah Nixon's son. I was Mr. Nixon, the new partner in Wingert and Bewley." The 2030 Club mostly contained young businessmen and professionals under the age of 30, with the Whittier local having about 50 members and Nixon becoming the Whittier president. He also served as president of the Duke University Alumni of California, Orange County Association of Cities president, and Whittier College Alumni Association president. Nixon developed a speech attacking FDR's court packing plan, and by the time he had been in Whittier for 2 years, he had given the speech to practically every service club in Southern California. He also made speeches for Wendell Willkie. Shortly after returning to Whittier, Nixon joined the local Little Theater group for the purpose of meeting people and initially helped with the lighting and sets. Nixon read for a role in The Night of January 16th and got it. Director Louise Baldwin remembering Nixon as having above average acting ability and being very handsome. In January 1938, as Nixon read for the part of Barry Jones in The Dark Tower, a tall, slender woman caught his attention. Her name was Pat Ryan, and Richard found himself smitten, asking her for a date, which she turned down. In their second meeting, he asked for a date and was again turned down. The third meeting saw him once more ask for a date, and when turned down, he said, "Don't laugh. Someday I'm going to marry you." She laughed and remembered, "I thought he was nuts or something. I guess I just looked at him. I couldn't imagine anyone ever saying something like that so suddenly." Thelma Catherine Ryan was born on March 16, 1912. She was the only daughter of the three Ryan children, and the proximity of her birth to St. Patrick's Day led to her nickname Pat, and when the girl was 14, her mother died of stomach cancer, forcing Thelma to take over household chores. She was nearly as active in high school as Richard, a member of the debate team, the filibuster club, and the dramatics club, as well as secretary of the student body in her senior year and vice president of her class. Pat graduated from high school and was forced to abandon going to college when her father contracted tuberculosis, and she had to nurse him and work to provide for her family. She was 18 when her father died and changed her name to Patricia. In 1933, Pat moved in with her brothers in a Los Angeles apartment near USC, and she enrolled as a major in merchandising, graduating cum laude from USC in 1937. Pat met Helene Colsey, a young teacher who would become her closest friend. Although Helene was initially concerned for Pat at Whittier High due to her being around older teachers, Pat solved the issue by serving coffee or doing dishes in the kitchen during PTA functions. Ambrose writes, Pat was a young, self-made, ambitious career woman who was clearly on her way, a woman of talent, beauty, and tact, with a large capacity for work and self-sacrifice. She was so obviously a superior person that one would have thought any young man's family would regard her as quite a catch. Nixon, meanwhile, was the son of a grocer who was still making his son pay back the money he had loaned him to go to law school. Pat agreed to a date with Nixon, and he arranged for his parents to come to the play to see Pat. Pat had Richard go on a date with one of her best friends, and Richard, determined to not have Pat take the long trolley ride to Los Angeles, drove her to dates with other men. Pat was resistant to marrying Nixon, remembering that she admired him from the very beginning but wasn't anxious to settle down. Ambrose observes that Pat gradually yielded to the intense young man who worked so hard to please her, and at one point was beginning to chase after Richard, with Hannah remembering being touched by Pat getting more involved with the Nixon family. The courtship lasted for 2 years before Pat consented to marry Richard. Richard and Pat married on June 21, 1940, at the Mission Inn in Riverside, in a ceremony attended by their immediate families. They headed for Mexico City, as Pat would recall, without any particular destination. Nixon moved to Washington in 1941 with a job with the Office of Price Administration, OPA, waiting for him as his Duke professor, David Cavers, had offered him a job within the bureaucracy. The OPA had a New Deal flavor to it, with its head Professor Thomas Emerson being a prominent New Dealer who served as president of the National Lawyers Guild and a leader in the Progressive Party of Henry Wallace. January 1942 saw Washington, D.C. at the center of the Allied war effort. Nixon found himself bored at the time, putting in long hours to write form letters, enforcing tire rationing. Thomas E. Harris, who served as Nixon's immediate supervisor, remembered, "No one thought of him as a right-winger in those days, but in style, if not in politics, he was thought of as a conservative because he lacked sophistication in the big city graces. He never quite fit in." Nixon would later declare that he became more conservative and disillusioned about bureaucracy through the OPA, and that he also learned price controls were ineffective. Ambrose writes that while Nixon could have stayed in the OPA, his being bored and dissatisfied led him to join the Navy. In August 1942, Nixon reported to an indoctrination school at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, while Pat stayed in Washington to become an assistant business analyst with the OPA. Nixon was 29 years old when he enlisted in the Navy, remaining there for 4 years. After completing courses at Quonset Point, Nixon put in for sea duty and opened his orders to find he was going to Ottumwa, Iowa, where the Navy was building an airfield in the cornfields for initial pilot training, and Nixon would be an aide to the executive officer. Pat, believing a woman must first and foremost be a homemaker, quit her job with the OPA to join her husband in Iowa, and soon found a job as a teller in the local bank. Nixon sailed the Pacific on the USS President Monroe, sharing a small cabin with 8 other officers. Lieutenant Lester Robel remembered that while he was seasick, Nixon would bring him crackers and soup, and he remembered Nixon as quiet and considerate, more of a listener than a talker. In January 1944, the SCAT detachment moved to Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, the airfield having fallen to the American forces a few months earlier and within striking distance of the Japanese base at Rabaul. As Nixon recounted in his memoir, shortly after I arrived, the Japanese staged an assault. When it was over, we counted 35 shell holes within 100 feet of the air raid bunker of 6 of us shared. Our tent had been completely destroyed. In January 1944, airships received 30 cargo planes carrying rocket bombs. During his stay on Green Island, Nixon saw death when the B 29 made a crash landing as it collided with a bulldozer. He helped carry the corpses away. The men in South Pacific were lonely. Nixon writing to Pat every day and reading the Bible repeatedly. He also learned to drink and engage in bull sessions, killing time by playing poker to the point of the game gradually becoming an obsession. As Ambrose explains, poker requires an acting ability that has to vary for each audience, and for the bluffer to make quick judgments about the personality, mood, level of drunkenness, financial position, and other characteristics of the man he is trying to bluff. The total amount of Nixon's winnings in the poker games is unknown, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to 10,000. Ambrose observes that through poker, Nixon was given the financial stake he needed to launch his career. Ambrose writes, "What was sad was the repeated pattern of Nixon's inability or unwillingness to keep a friendship alive after the original reason for it came to an end. He would not carry any excess baggage into his post war career. In his world, he had time only for men who could help him get ahead. Trapped in the Navy with no opportunity for advancement, he could afford to be Mr. Roberts. But back in the real world, he suppressed that side of himself. He could talk eloquently about Red, but he never wrote him, he never looked him up, never tried to contact him in any way. It is noteworthy that in his spectacularly successful post-war career, no one from the Navy nor from Duke Law School, none of his classmates from Whittier High School or Whittier College, not even any members of his family, save only Pat, played a significant role in public or private."